Hello, everybody. Welcome to Bitcoin Not Crypto. My name is Forrest Stevens. We have a guest today on the show, John Dennehy from My First Bitcoin. I wanted to hear, just to get the show started, how you got interested in Bitcoin. What was it about it that kind of drew you in?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me. So before Bitcoin, I was a political activist. I recognized the evils of the concentration of power and the evils of the state. I had probably been arrested maybe 15 or 16 times in the years before I discovered Bitcoin for political protest. So the first time that I heard about Bitcoin was in early 2013 when there was a quote unquote bank bail in Cyprus, where the government, they didn't have enough money. So they literally took it out of the bank accounts of the citizens. And I read a throwaway line in an article that said something like Bitcoin users unaffected. And I was like, who? Who's not affected by this? And then I looked up Bitcoin, what Bitcoin was, read the white paper, and I was like, holy shit. Like this is a really powerful tool that will probably be crushed by the government because it is so powerful to the individual. Um, but fingers crossed they don't, right? Like this is before I really looked into it too deeply, just like at a surface level. It was like, I'm so happy this exists. I hope it succeeds. But some powerful forces probably will not want that to happen. Um, but here we are, this is now, I guess, 11 years later, 11 and a half years later, and have I still think that first part, like, holy shit, what a powerful tool for the individual. Um, but I no longer think that second part. Now that second part is replaced, and nobody could stop it.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's amazing. So what led you from that space to create My First Bitcoin, which is in El Salvador? It's educating people to get them onto Bitcoin. What can you tell me a little bit about what that is and how you went from there all the way to My First Bitcoin?
I mean, there was a pretty long pause in between when I was not working in the Bitcoin space. Um, and I was doing activism by other forms, mostly journalism, but often writing about financial literacy. Um, and in 2021, El Salvador announced that they were going to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, and that was another wild moment for me, right? To like be like, wow, this is like, is this real? Right? Is this really happening? That there is a nation state that is adopting Bitcoin. Is it real? How do I feel about it? And and then recognizing the importance of it. Um, what's the best way to make sure that the example is a positive one for this First Nation? So this is like the pandemic was still kind of sort of going on, um, and the pandemic allowed me a lot of deep thinking about the state of the world, and so I was already thinking that the major problem in the world was lack of agency in the individual's life, right? And that has these terrible second and third order effects where if we're not in control of our own life, then we don't really care about the future, right? Because we can't create it, we can't be a part of it. Somebody else is creating it, so who cares? Um, and it has put us on a really bad path. And the solution, I believe, is to empower the individual, and the best tool we have to do that is introductory Bitcoin education. It like naturally leads the individual to reimagine their relationship with power, right? Where it's not, we're not choosing between Democrat and Republican, right? we're not choosing somebody else to make decisions for us to create the future for us. We could do it ourselves. Um, and I think once you learn about Bitcoin, I love Bitcoin, but it's actually not about Bitcoin. It's about what Bitcoin teaches us and about what the path that Bitcoin leads us on. So I think a Bitcoin educated world is a more empowered world where the individual feels that they have control of their own present and therefore their own future and are more active in trying to make sure that it's a good future for them and for all of us. So I really think that Bitcoin education is just like a gateway drug to a better world.
That's awesome. How do you get people interested in actually coming to that educational space? Do you pitch it like just how to learn about Bitcoin, how to get your hands on Bitcoin, or is it like do you go into that space, or like you try to say like this will teach you freedom and independence and open thinking and all this kind of stuff? Like how does that work?
Yeah. El Salvador is a special place now. We don't have to try that hard to get students. There's in 2021, when the Bitcoin law went into effect here, which is also when we got started, the knowledge base was very, very close to zero. Like almost no one knew anything about Bitcoin. Yet it was now legal tender. It was like in the news, people were talking about it, but they didn't really have um, a very good understanding of it. So there was a lot of curiosity, right? So we've never, I mean, our limitation on the number of students that we teach, and we've taught about 35,000 in person here in El Salvador since we began. Uh, and that doesn't include, we've trained hundreds of teachers to teach on their own. It doesn't include them. It doesn't include the projects in over 30 countries around the world that we work with. It doesn't include online teachings. That's kind of just like a base number. Um, but our limitation is not finding students. Our limitation is well, I want to say funding limits are in-person classes, which is in part why we've started to build more online tools because that scales a lot better. It's like the cost per student goes down a lot. Um, but our limitation is you could say funding, but it's also we'd rather train. So we trained 500 public school teachers here to teach about Bitcoin. And they're going to do it on their own now. I mean, they are doing it on their own for the Ministry of Education. Um, because we don't want to have 500 teachers, right? Like we're limited by our own desire to not centralize things around us as well.
If you're interested in getting yourself some Bitcoin, I would recommend taking a look at Bitcoin Well. There's a link in the description, and if you use my referral code, you'll actually get some free Bitcoin. They're the best place, in my opinion, to buy Bitcoin because they're a non-custodial exchange, which means they never hold your Bitcoin for you. When you send them money, they'll send you Bitcoin directly to your wallet, and you can buy on-chain or Lightning through them, and they have a swap function at a 0% fee, so you can swap in between the two. They also have non-KYC options, and they're available in Canada and the United States. You can pay your bills through them, you can dollar cost average through them, and they even give you reward points, which you can redeem through the Wishing Well competition, and even possibly win yourself 1,000,000 sats through that. So check them out. Link in the description. That goes to support this show. Thanks, everybody.
So what does a adoption in El Salvador actually look like? I mean, 35,000 people trained through just as a basis is huge. But are people really adopting Bitcoin? Like, what does it actually look like in El Salvador right now?
As most things are, it's somewhere in the middle of these two extremes that I think a lot of people like to talk about, either that adoption is really low or that everybody's using it. Um, the reality is I would put the number, and this is a rough number, but it's more to illustrate the point. About 20% of the population is using Bitcoin at least very occasionally, right? Maybe not every day, but in the past 6 months, they've used Bitcoin. Um, and at once that seems low because that means 80% isn't using it, the majority. But again, going back 3 years ago, it was zero, right? So I'd like I'd like to highlight the trend more than anything. To go from 0 to 20 in 3 years is actually pretty fast. Um, I think if you're expecting it to go any faster for the first 20%, then it's just unrealistic. Um, I think what will be really interesting is the next 20%, right? Like once then we're starting to get to almost half the population has some recent use or knowledge of it. Uh, we're still El Salvador is such an interesting place. It's kind of like test net for a lot of things, right? Like it's test net for grassroots education with my first Bitcoin. It's test net for a lot of like lightning service providers and companies that just want to see if there's a product market fit in a place where people are actually using Bitcoin. Um, so I think it's actually probably most companies are losing money in El Salvador because it's more like they're getting really good data out of it, right? There's nowhere else where you could get that data and improve your product so quickly. And um, I'm cautiously optimistic about where adoption is. So with education, which is what I'm most aware of, again, 3 years ago there wasn't a program from the government. Like there was no education from the state. I mean, there was just no education, period. And now what's happening is so the Ministry of Education. So we developed an open source Bitcoin diploma, and the Ministry of Education uh, borrowed that and made a couple of tweaks and have their own Bitcoin diploma now. And we've helped them, along with Bitcoin Beach, train the first 500 teachers that are actually out there teaching it now. But the exciting thing is, so that's a pilot, right? I mean, it's great. I don't know how many they've impacted, a few more thousands of students. And next year it will only grow. But I think the really exciting thing is actually that starting next year, this is effectively break now. The school year follows the calendar year more or less here. So the really exciting thing isn't that teachers are being trained, it's that the Ministry of Education is creating its own Bitcoin department to own this, right? So the next 500 teachers aren't going to be trained by us. It's going to be trained by this first generation of teachers. We'll train the second and the third, and we could actually kind of take a step back. And again, it's the same sort of thing. I think it's pretty good to be at this point after 3 years that the government is creating its own department for it, for education, or within the Ministry of Education, like a separate subgroup for that. And I think what's really cool about El Salvador is that it will be faster the next time, right? It'll be better and faster. There's already a template now. You got to modify it but it's not going to take 3 years to get to the first 20% for the next country. It's going to take 2 years, and the next one's going to take 1 year. And by the time we get to the one after that, then I think it's over, right? Like, yeah, we're not talking about like which country. It's just maybe it's just a normal thing at that point.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. I mean, I agree with your sentiment there that 20% over 3 years, that's massive. From 0 to 20 is huge. And Bitcoin as well, the idea of it's like, well, Bitcoin itself is a network, right? And the more people know about it, the more they're open to sharing about it, and the more it affects them personally. Like, I know Bitcoin has affected me positively so much that I want to share it with as many people as possible. The idea of it, I mean, that's even the reason for this podcast, is just an outlet to express ideas about Bitcoin. And I'm sure that's there's probably some great success stories or some effects that people have had from adopting Bitcoin personally, and they want to share with people they love, their friends and family. So it's probably like, I wonder if that adoption curve is even accelerating because of the network effect.
Yeah, and it really depends how you measure it, right? If you're measuring people that use it every day, then the number is obviously much lower. But if you're measuring it, so for example, I have a young child that was born here, and he has a nanny who's Salvadorian, and she just started getting her salary in Bitcoin yesterday, right? Uh, so now she's on that list. She's part of that 20% now, and yeah, I think it does accelerate. I think the key is to be educated. And to use the same example, she hasn't, I mean, I think she's going to take some classes soon, but she'll be a much better ambassador once she's educated, right? El Salvador it's a strange situation where there might be some people in that 20% that don't actually know about Bitcoin, which is like a crazy thing that in I'm from New York. In New York, there's lots of people that have a knowledge base about Bitcoin but have never used it. Here, there's a good chunk of people that use Bitcoin but don't know anything about it.
That's funny. That's like a weird reversal. Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think there's something unique about El Salvador that has led to its adoption of Bitcoin?
It's kind of like a perfect storm sort of situation. Um, they're small. It was always going to be a small country to go first. Uh, so they're more nimble. They are definitely not advantaged by the status quo. They have already lost 24 years ago now. They already lost control over their own currency. They dollarized in 2000 or 2001. Um, so there's pros and cons to that. The pros is the political class here doesn't have the ability to abuse their own currency, but the downside is they don't have any control of it being abused in the US, right? Like all that money that was printed during the pandemic and led to inflation, they got all of the inflation here, none of the benefits. People weren't getting checks, they weren't getting rebates, they weren't that you got that in the US and you also got inflation, right? You just got the inflation here. Nobody got any checks from the government. Nobody got any like more dollars because of it, but things just got more expensive and so there's not much to lose for them. Um, they're not in a good position as it is, so there's not much to lose. They're small, and then there's probably a number of countries that fit that description actually, but added on top of that is the popularity of the president. Um, I mean, the Bitcoin laws is one of the most unpopular things that he's done, right? Like he's wildly popular here. Uh, and this was, people didn't know. People were like, "What's Bitcoin?" Like, I don't know. I guess we'll find out. Now I think it's popular. The price has gone up, but but the fact that he wanted it to happen and he has so much authority, really. I mean, there's he has such a strong mandate from the people um, that there wasn't this organized opposition within the government that was like, no, 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 we got to stop this law from going into effect. Like, uh, so things happened really quickly, which is why the speed was so dramatic. Like it was, they announced it in June, and they passed the bill 2 days after they announced it, and the bill went into effect 90 days after they passed it. So it was like, okay, 90 days, we're adopting Bitcoin. Like, yeah, interesting times. But I wonder if it had to be that way. Like if the first country, if it was more typical and very slow and bureaucratic, it would have. I mean, Bitcoin has its enemies, right? Um, it would have given a lot of time to uh, organize an opposition to it. Probably not domestically, probably internationally. Um, I think I almost had to be fast. Like a lot of special things came together to make El Salvador the first country.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned there that it's probably one of the more unpopular things, at least at first. Do you have any insight into why it was unpopular?
I mean, this is obviously just me being a foreigner talking about things here, so I might get some stuff wrong, but I've lived here for 3.5 years now, and I actually previously lived in Ecuador for 5 years. And something in common between the two nations is they both dollarized in 2000, 2001, like at the turn of the century. And in both cases, and I think basically every time a nation dollarizes, it's a painful experience that the people aren't looking forward to going through again quickly. Um, Typically when a nation dollarizes, then people that have their savings in the previous currency, which is most people, the people with access, there's an elite that has access to saving mechanisms. Outside of that, maybe they have, dollar accounts or euro accounts, or they have, they have property in Miami or something, right? That's like where their wealth is stored. Um, but most people store their wealth in the nation's currency, and when a country dollarizes, that currency becomes worthless, right? So it's like a rush to get out of it, and you could save your whole life and then effectively like have nothing after a dollarization. And I think that was people were afraid that something similar was going to happen. So what happened here in El Salvador, it was called the colon, was their own currency. They announced that they were going to dollarize, but they were going to use both currencies. So don't worry, you know, we're going to have two legal tenders. You could use colones, you could use dollars. It's up to you. And within a month, like colones were worthless, right? Um, Nobody wanted them. People wanted the harder money. So people that listened to that messaging, like, oh yeah, I don't need to do anything. They lost everything. So it was the same messaging for Bitcoin. It was like we're still keeping dollars. We're gonna have two currencies now. Don't worry. So I think a lot of people are like, yeah, that's what you said last time, and now this is this digital thing. Like I don't even know how can I change my dollars into Bitcoin? But they say that the price goes up and down, and like what, there was a lot of uncertainty, and I think maybe some past trauma from the dollarization, which is a generation before. Like, people lived through that. People who were maybe not the children and teenagers, but anybody, 20 years and older had lived through that experience, and I think we're pretty skeptical of the same thing happening. Um, yeah. So I don't know if there's other more complex reasons why it wasn't the most popular thing. I think it was some trauma from dollarization, and it's just fear of the unknown, right? Like I think now people understand it better, so they accept it more. And again, that's kind of my drum to beat, but education, like education makes a big difference.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some parallels there with people going over to the harder money of U.S. dollars instead of the the national currency of El Salvador. Now it's like I mean, the US dollars hasn't collapsed to nothing compared to Bitcoin, but maybe it's a slower progression over to a harder money. I wonder if there's a parallel there that El Salvadorians will find out and figure out maybe.
Yeah, I think so. So this is just some personal anecdotes, but Salvadorians that I know that are kind of using both currencies um, tend to, maybe they have a small business and they're accepting Bitcoin and they're just keeping it. Not that many people are paying with Bitcoin. They don't have like a huge amount, but they have both Bitcoin and dollars, like personally. Uh, they tend to spend their dollars first. So I think it's happening. It's just slower. The fact that the price of Bitcoin relative to dollars is so volatile, I think adds a lot of static and a lot of noise. Um, so it's not on a short time frame. It is not clear at all that that's a better currency. On a long time frame, if the more you zoom out, the clearer that becomes. Uh, but we're not used to zooming out, right? I think that's actually the problem with the world is we're not used to zooming out. We're used to, again, going back to uh, what I was saying at the start of the show, when you don't have control of your life, you're not incentivized to look into the future because you have no influence or you feel like you have no influence over that future. Somebody else is making the rules. So you're living on a shorter time scale. I think that's what the world has become used to. And Bitcoin doesn't work that way. If you look at Bitcoin short term, like what how has it performed in the past 24 hours or in the past 7 days, which is what we're used to. We're used to looking at these very short time frames. Then it's cloudy, it's confusing, it's not clear. Um, and we're still used to listening to authority figures just because they're authority, not because they're knowledgeable, right? Like a lot of the people that talk ill of Bitcoin are actually the least informed about it, right? And that's an interesting phenomenon all by itself. But um, we to have a lot of noise in the present relative to the value of Bitcoin, and I don't mean that just in a price sense, but just in like the value of it. How is this valuable to the individual? Uh, the fact that it's hard to see on a short time scale, and there are authorities that are uninformed or malicious, um, really slows things down. But that's it's still fast though. It slows things down, but it's still happening, and it's still, if you zoom out even more, then it's like, wow, this is actually pretty fast. If you're looking at day to day, then it seems slow, but the more you zoom out, the clearer it becomes.
Yeah, for sure, and it's all perspective. That's basically what you're saying there is perspective. Yeah. Um, One thing that's interesting, I think, there's kind of this conversation here in North America and maybe some of the developed world where Bitcoin is getting placed in this asset wrapper. It's just saying, oh, this is digital gold. This is an asset. This is property. Um, El Salvador's attempting to use it as a currency. Those two things feel different to me. And yeah, I just wanted to get your perspective on, is it a currency? Is it an asset? What do you think about all that?
I mean, it's both. Um, it's a currency, and I feel very confident in saying that because that's how I use it, right? That's how I pay, more than 90% of financial transactions that I make are in Bitcoin at this point, right? So it's a currency, it's real. Like you don't need to, there's nothing more powerful than actually using it in real life to prove that point. And it's also an asset because it's a store of value, right? Um, it's a medium of exchange and a store of value, and it's more. I think one of I don't know whose quote I'm stealing here, but something that resonated with me about Bitcoin is a mirror. You you see what you want to see in it. It's a tool. It could do different things for different people. It is a tool for liberation, but it's also a tool for oppression. Like the same central bank digital currencies are like the malicious uh, inverse of Bitcoin, but it's the same technology, really, right? It's like one is decentralized and the other is centralized. Um, but there's actually quite a bit in common between what makes Bitcoin powerful for the individual and what could make similar technology powerful for the state. Um, so the state looks at it and they're like, this is a more efficient way to track and to censor. And the individual, like the freedom loving individual, looks at it and says, this is now I have a capability to prevent them from tracking and censoring. Um, so Bitcoin is different things to different people.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And in there too is kind of the other things that Bitcoin leads to. You mentioned this earlier about how Bitcoin is kind of just the door opening to all sorts of different maybe changing ideas of the world for an individual. One of those being independence. How does knowledge of Bitcoin kind of lead to more independent behavior and thinking?
I think the way that I see Bitcoin is if you like Bitcoin, it's because you're hopeful about humanity, right? You think that we could do better than this, like we're capable of more. Um, and Bitcoin teaches you, so money and power are synonymous. So Bitcoin teaches you, it shows you that you can have power in your own life, right? You could control your own money, and nobody could tell you how to use it. Uh, that's that's totally up to you. And realizing that is to know that we don't have that in the world that we're coming from, right? It's to see that we're not free, right? That we don't actually have that power. It's an illusion. Um, so I think it translates to a lot of other things. Again, it's like a gateway drug. That's how I think of it. If once you realize that you can control your money, then you realize that you could have more control in your life. And that changes the incentive. So, you're talking about capability and knowledge and all that. And even just studying, right? Just learning a skill, just being a better woodworker or teacher or scholar or expert in whatever field, plumber, whatever it is, um, to study something, to learn something is an investment in your future. Uh, and again, if you know that you have control of your present and a say in your future, then it motivates you to study, right? To learn, to improve yourself. If you have a very short time horizon, then you're not motivated to do that. But that very first step, that I'm not in control of my own life, but I can be, I think sets off a number of potential mental shifts, right? Like I think the tool that we need to liberate is our mind, right? Is to realize that we we can, right? Like to realize that we can we can build the future we want. We don't have to accept the future that's given. Like that shift right there. Either I think we live in a world where we're just like, well, we got to accept the future that we're given, but that's wrong. I mean, that's one choice, but there is a choice here. You could also choose to create the future that you want. And if you don't, if you're not creating the future that you want, it means that somebody else is creating the future for you.
Wow. Yeah, that's yeah, very true. And yeah, I think that Bitcoin is a rabbit hole. For me, this podcast started with the idea of, before it was called Bitcoin, not crypto. It was going to just be something like, each video was going to be something I just learned about myself because of Bitcoin, because it just teaches. It's not just, oh, this is a better money, and we have a broken money that is, controlled by the state and printed for free. Well, we all have to work for it. Like, all of that is all good, and we should learn all that. But like, I learned a lot about myself from Bitcoin. Just, it was like self discovery through Bitcoin, which was, yeah, it was kind of cool, I think. Um, I am curious to get a little bit back to My First Bitcoin, which is the organization you have there. What does it actually look like for somebody that goes to one of the classes? What are some of the first things that you're wanting to express and share and show people about Bitcoin, so that they can kind of get their foot in the door of understanding it?
We have here visual aid. This is the Bitcoin diploma, which is a 10-week program. Um, and this is, we have other courses, but they follow a similar philosophy. So I'll just explain it through the lens of the Bitcoin diploma. It's a 10-week course, or a 10 course program, 10 sessions. Um, the first 5 don't talk about Bitcoin. The first 5, like the very first page, is what is money, right? Like what do you know about money? Tell us what money is. Why does money exist? What's the history of money? Um, so much of, and then when once you understand the world we live in, then you could understand the future we could have, right? That's kind of the philosophy. So we have a one session like intro class, which is basically just a condensed version of that. So first one part, what is the world we live in, and one part, how can that be different, and how can Bitcoin play a role in that? Um, yeah, but I think a powerful, maybe a more direct answer to your question, a powerful tool to teach Bitcoin once we do get to that, whether it's in week 5 or minute 20, right? Or minute 1, right? If it's like just at a meetup and it's like more casual, because we also, like we had a meetup last night, we have 5 meetups a month, and people just show up with questions about Bitcoin. So we might get right to the point there. Um, but it's to show them. So download a wallet and I'll send you some sats right now, right? And it's like within a minute of going to the app store, they have sats on their phone. They have Bitcoin. And it's much easier than people think it is, right? They think that it's like gonna be this like you need to have a doctorate to understand Bitcoin. But it's like, wait, I just made a Bitcoin transaction. Maybe they send it back to you, and it's like, I just did that. And that's an aha moment to show, don't tell, that it's actually, mm, forget all the noise. This is the reality. Like you now have Bitcoin in your pocket. Um, and then the second thing is, so this is always going to be done with a non-KYC wallet, right? We're not going to like register and come back a week later and finish the conversation. Uh, it's always with a non-KYC wallet, and then it's like, hey, did you notice that you didn't have to KYC yourself. Did you notice that we didn't have to ask permission? So what we just did, your cousin in Venezuela could send money here, right? So that's actually, I mean, Venezuela is an example here, but in different parts of the world, it's a different example. Money doesn't, there's a lot of restrictions on money, right? Like you can't send, there are Venezuelans here that can't send value back to Venezuela, right? They could send Bitcoin. They can't send dollars or bolivars. They can't send fiat, but they could send Bitcoin. Um, and it's like, wow, it's really easy and it is unstoppable. Are like you could show someone, not tell them, you could show someone that in 2 minutes that it's easy and unstoppable.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. It's instant value transfer and it's global. And yeah, it can be as simple as that, right? Like Bitcoin can just be that for somebody, but then you can go so much deeper and if you wanted to, right? But it doesn't, you don't have to. Like to use Bitcoin, you could literally just stop there with your knowledge if you want, if you really wanted to, and you could continue to use it. Um, I'm curious to know about, are you expanding this beyond El Salvador? And another question just to tie in there is is like, how are you guys funding all of this? How do you guys expand this?
So yes, we are expanding significantly beyond El Salvador, but in our own way, not in the fiat way. It's actually behind me are two maps with, I mean, you probably can't see, but there's a bunch of countries scratched off, and the country's 30 to be exact, or 32, I think. Um, the countries scratched off are countries where we have a working relationship with an education project there. And we share materials, we generally use the same materials, and we agree to the same set of values. Um, so we are expanding in a way that seeks to empower rather than control. So we're only expanding in that we are trying to create materials that other educators find useful, and it's always open source, so anybody could use it. But more than that, try to create a community around it, uh, to share best practices and to really, drive home that point that this is a global movement and we're stronger together, right? You know, there's a project, say in South Africa, and they realized that the way that activity 2 and lesson 4 could be improved by doing X, right? Then it's like, then they share it and we improve it. We all improve it. Maybe it's only true in South Africa. It's not true in other places. Uh, but it speeds up the timeline to do this. So the way that it's structured is if you agree to a core set of values, and that is that the Bitcoin education must be independent, impartial, community led, Bitcoin only, high quality, and teach empowerment. If you agree to those 6 consensus rules and you can demonstrate proof of work, then you can apply to be part of the network. And we really try to borrow from Bitcoin, so we consider ourselves the Genesis node. And being the Genesis node, we created the consensus rules for the network, and that's what it is. Those 6 are the consensus rules for the network. So now to join the network, you have to agree to the consensus rules, and a majority of the existing nodes have to admit you. So it's a self-governing network. Um, the network actually decides whether, I mean, you sign a document, you sign an MOU, that you agree to these consensus rules, but like, if you're talking about Ethereum on your Twitter profile, then we don't believe you, right? We don't believe that you're Bitcoin only, so we won't admit you. Or oftentimes rejections, and we only accept about half of the applicants, but oftentimes they're too early, and it's like, hey, circle back in another block or two. So each month is a new block, and you can apply. Um, like have your first meetup. Like we'd like to see a little bit of proof of work. So less no and more not yet. Um, but yeah, so now we work with more than 60 projects in more than 30 countries around the world, uh, in a way that is decentralized, and each each node in the network is independent and sovereign, but we agree to common values and we acknowledge that we're more than the sum of our parts, right? We're stronger together. Um, and financially, and that's a dream, right? Like I can't believe how quickly that's expanded. Um, Financially is also really interested. So again, everything that we do at My First Bitcoin, we try to live the values, right? Not just talk about things, but uh, actually manifest them in the physical realm, like follow through with our words. Um, and funding is a important, in pretty important aspect of that. So on a long enough timeline, Bitcoin education will be captured by those who fund it. What that means is, and maybe it's worthwhile to show how that's happened in the fiat space. Um, Education or media, my background is in journalism, so I'm most familiar with media. The funded model is broken, and that's why people in the Bitcoin space hate journalists. Not because journalism is bad. Journalism is actually a good thing. It's a social good. Um, but the apparatus has been distorted by its funding sources. So it's not about pushing back. Like journalism should speak truth to power, but there's not a lot of money in that. there's there's a, there's a lot more money in doing what power wants, right? In doing what you know it's easier. I mean, it's mostly the funded model is mostly like sponsors, right? It's mostly like for-profit corporations that are funding media, um, and they don't want you to think for yourself. They don't want you to be critical. They want you to buy their product, right? They want to create uh some doubt that you have, like, am I good enough? Is this right? Like, okay, well, they just told me that I should use that product and everything's better. They're not incentivized to empower you. It's the opposite. They're incentivized to dictate to you. And we have this opportunity with Bitcoin to do it differently. The danger is that we follow that same model with Bitcoin education. And Bitcoin education is steered by commercial interest. Yeah, sure. Companies that maybe they have Bitcoin on their balance sheet or they have a product that is geared at Bitcoiners, but it's the same broken incentive structure. If they're funding education, they're not trying to empower the students. They're not trying to encourage them to think for themselves. They're trying to tell them what to think, right? That's why they're in it. Um, that's what's happened in the fiat space, and there's a real danger that that could happen in the Bitcoin space. So we're very conscious of that. I mean, we get approached all the time with people that want to give us money if we say X in our materials, right? And it's like, no, I mean, we have bills to pay, and we'd be happy if you donated, but we're not. We're in the business of empowering people, and if you're not into that, then good luck. Uh, so we are majority community funded. Um, and that's from individuals and platforms like Geyser. We get a lot of donations there. I think we're actually the most funded project ever on Geyser. We also get grants. So we get grants from like OpenSats and HRF and Block, which are no strings attached. Like it's like they're not trying to change how we teach things to students. So we're very particular about our funding sources. Um, and I think Bitcoiners should think about that more. Should think about, as we're bringing a new generation into this world, what sort of are we just trying to replace the old system with an orange, like just painted orange, or are we trying to do things differently? Are we trying to create a different future? Because if we are, we need to do things differently in the present. And I think that funding is the biggest part of that. Um, I mean, look at the fiat world. The way that things are funded is, I think, the primary way that the world has been corrupted into a place where we are told what to think rather than empowered to think for ourselves. And if we're not conscious of that and we're not actively pursuing alternatives to that as this new Bitcoin world emerges, then we will repeat the same mistakes and we will not realize the potential that is before us with Bitcoin.
No, it's an interesting conversation to have. It's about ethics, right, and about just and yeah, that ethics comes into play big for funding.
Yeah, and we need to, like, Bitcoiners shouldn't expect everything to be for free because nothing is for free. You are the product, right? Like, so if you don't want to be the product and you don't want your children to be the product, then that means that we have to step up and like, if you have some spare sats, then pay it forward, not for yourself, but for the next generation. Um, that is, having that longer time preference is how we're going to create a better world. Not thinking, well, yeah, I have some spare sats, but fund education so the real fruits of that labor is 20 years down the road. No, like, no, you have to, the further ahead you think, the better world will create. And this is the sort of thing that it seems fine to accept money today with strings attached to educate our youth about a new potential future. But like, the further into the future you look and the more you follow the logical conclusions of different funding sources for Bitcoin, I think the conclusion that you'll come to is we need to support this. Like, we need to support independent Bitcoin education. We need to fund it. We need to defend it.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really amazing what you're doing over there, and yeah, the strong ethics there is awesome. We're just coming up to time here, John. So just to wrap up real quickly, I'll put all the links in the descriptions as well. But where can people find you, support your work? What's the best direction for them to go?
Couple of things. Me personally is just J Dennehy Writes on Twitter, and the project, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever the socials that we're on, is always my first Bitcoin underscore. And then to our website is myfirstbitcoin.io. And on the website, you could, again, everything is open source, so you could just download materials and start teaching on your own. If you do want to be part of a community that does that, you see benefit in that. On the web page, you can find more information about the Node network and how you might join that if you're interested, and just other ways to get involved. We'll have a Bitcoin Educators Unconference in Nashville, April 10th at Bitcoin Park, which is kind of a new thing where we try to bring educators together from around the world to share best practices. So the next time we're doing that and that's international. We've done it in a few different countries. Um, the next one is April 10th in Nashville, so that's going to be great. We have a separate website for that, which is Bitcoin Unconference. I don't know if that's .io or .com, but yeah, just go to the main site and everything links back to it.
Sweet, awesome. Thanks so much, John, for coming on. I mean, I could talk to you for way longer. We're just running out of time here, but it's fascinating stuff you're doing, and I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.